Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty heavy in the world of ethics.
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher.
It is. It's Derek Parfit's repugnant conclusion. And for those of you out there who, really like to think about this stuff, this isn't just some obscure philosophical problem.
Right.
It really gets to the core of how we, as, moral beings, evaluate different ways the world would be, especially when we're talking about like whole populations of people and how good their lives are.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Population ethics, which is kind of the broader field where this problem sits, asks some pretty fundamental questions about, like, what makes a world better?
Yeah.
Is it just about having more happy people, even if their lives aren't that great?
Right.
Do we have any kind of obligation to, like, think about how many people there will be in the future and what their quality of life will be?
Yeah, yeah.
And the repugnant conclusion, it kind of throws a wrench in all of this because it suggests that maybe a world with a huge number of people who have lives that are just barely worth living could actually be better than a world with fewer people who are all living really amazing lives.
Yeah, it's that barely worth living part that just feels so wrong to a lot of people,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. It
Yep,
goes against our intuition.
totally. And, it's become this central issue in ethics precisely because any ethical theory that wants to be taken seriously has to figure out how to deal with this problem of like how population size and the quality of people's lives, like how those two things interact when we make moral judgments.
Yeah, it really makes us question what we mean when we say something is better or worse.
Right. Yeah.
It's easy to say, oh, a good life is better than a bad life.
Yeah.
But what if we're talking about billions of lives?
Yeah.
Does that change things? And like you said, it's especially relevant for anyone who's interested in philosophy because it raises questions about the foundations of our moral reasoning.
Totally. So, in this deep dive, what we want to do is kind of follow Parfit's train of thought to see how he arrived at this really weird conclusion.
Yeah.
And then we're going to explore all these really clever ways that philosophers have tried to, like, get around it or escape it.
Right, because it's a tough one to swallow.
It is. And, we've got a bunch of, like, really key philosophical papers and books that address this specific problem. So, we've got, plenty of material to work with here.
It's a rich area of debate, for sure.
Yeah, it is. It is. So, are we ready to sort of unpack this thing?
Absolutely, let's do it.
Okay, so first off, it's important to know that Parfit wasn't the first person to stumble upon this kind of idea.
That's right. There were some earlier hints of this, even going back to the early 1900s.
Yeah, like Henry Sidgwick, he was a philosopher back then, and he pointed out that if we're trying to, like, maximize happiness in the world, like a good utilitarian, then the ideal number of people might not be where everyone's like super happy on average,
Right.
but it's where the total amount of happiness is the biggest.
So it's about the total sum, not just the average.
Right, exactly. And that kind of sets the stage, right?
Definitely.
And, Parfit himself mentions a bunch of other philosophers who kind of touched on similar ideas, like Broad, McTaggart, and Narveson.
Yeah, he gave credit where credit was due.
Yeah, he did. He did.
Mhm.
But, what Parfit did so well was he really brought this implication into focus.
Right.
And he showed just how hard it is to avoid it once you start thinking along those lines. And a big part of his argument hinges on this thing called the non-identity problem.
That's a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so the non-identity problem, right?
Right.
Parfit gives us these two scenarios, and they both involve this pregnant woman.
Okay.
And let's say there's this illness that's going around, right?
Yeah.
In the first scenario, there's a treatment that can prevent the child from being born with this illness that would cause them a lot of suffering.
Yeah, that's a pretty clear-cut case.
Right, like it seems obvious she should get the treatment for the sake of her child, so the kid can have a better life.
Yeah, most people would agree with that.
Right, but then Parfit throws in this curveball. He says, okay, what if the woman gets pregnant now while she's still sick?
Okay.
The child will be born with this, you know, permanent impairment.
Uh-huh.
But if she waits until she recovers, she'll have a totally different child.
So the identity of the child changes.
Exactly. And now it's not so simple to say, oh, she should wait so the child can have a better life.
Right, because the child who would have been born if she hadn't waited wouldn't even exist if she does wait.
Exactly. So it's not about the same child having a better or worse life. It's about two different children altogether.
Yeah, that's the heart of the non-identity problem.
Mhm.
You're not comparing two potential states of the same individual.
Right. Like we're not talking about the same kid growing up with or without this condition.
It's a different kid entirely.
It's two completely different people. So how do we even begin to compare those situations morally?
Right. How do you weigh those outcomes?
Right. So Perfect proposes this idea called the no difference view, which basically says that, like, this change in identity, shouldn't really change our moral evaluation.
Okay.
So just like the mom should try to prevent suffering in the first case, she should also wait to get pregnant in the second case.
So even though it's a different child, the moral decision remains the same.
Yeah. And he says one way to capture this no difference view is through the lens of total utilitarianism.
Okay. And what does that mean exactly?
So total utilitarianism basically says that the best outcome is the one with the biggest total amount of, well, whatever we think makes life good.
Whether it's happiness, well-being, or something else.
Right, exactly. Like some measure of goodness spread across everyone.
And summed up across all individuals who exist.
Right. So here's where it starts to get, well, kind of messed up.
Yeah. This is where it takes a turn.
Parfit uses this like diagram figure 1 to show how this works.
Okay.
Imagine population A, a group of people living great lives.
Like they fulfilling jobs, strong relationships, plenty of opportunities for growth, all that good stuff.
Right, they're thriving. Now picture population Z, way, way bigger than A, but everyone's life is just barely worth living.
They have the bare minimum, maybe food and shelter, but not much else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, according to total utilitarianism, even though life in Z is so much worse in terms of quality,
Right.
because there are so many more people, the total amount of well-being in Z could actually be bigger than in A.
And therefore, Z would be the morally better outcome.
Right. And that's the repugnant conclusion.
It's repugnant because it suggests that a massive quantity of barely good lives can somehow outweigh a smaller quantity of really good lives.
Exactly. It just feels wrong. And Perfit doesn't stop there. He goes on to give us another argument, the mere addition paradox.
Which is illustrated with figure 2.
Right. So we start again with population A. The happy, high quality of life folks.
The A-listers.
Right. And then we imagine adding another group of people, just as big as A, but their lives are a little less good.
Still good, but not as good as the original A group. Let's call them A plus A.
Right. A plus A.
So you have the original A folks still living their awesome lives, and now you've added this A plus group who are doing pretty well, but not quite as well.
Right. And it seems like adding more people who are living good lives shouldn't make things worse, right?
Right. It seems like A plus should be at least as good as A, if not better.
Right. That's the first step, and it seems pretty harmless, right?
Quite a.
But then we bring in population B.
Okay.
B has the same number of people as A plus A, but everyone in B has a quality of life that's kind of in between A and A plus A.
So the average well-being
Mhm.
in B is a bit higher than the average in A plus A, and things are more equally distributed.
Right. It's like we leveled things out a bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And now it seems like B is better than A plus A.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
Right.
Yeah, I can see where this is going.
So if B is better than A plus A, and A plus is at least not worse than A, then logically B should be better than A.
Right.
And you can keep repeating this process.
Add more people with slightly worse lives, level things out, and each step seems okay on its own.
But where does it end up?
Eventually, it leads us to Z, that same massive population where everyone's just barely getting by.
So through this series of seemingly reasonable steps, we've gone from A, a small group with great lives, to Z, a huge group with barely worth living lives. And somehow Z is supposed to be better.
Yeah, it's like this crazy magic trick.
It really is.
You think you're making things better each step of the way, but you end up in this awful place.
Yeah, it's a real paradox.
And there's another way to get to Z too, right?
Okay.
You start with A and just gradually add more and more people at a slightly lower level of well-being, and maybe even slightly improve the well-being of the original A people along the way.
And then level things out again.
Yeah, and even that process, which seems kind of beneficial, I can end up with that same repugnant Z.
It's a challenge for any moral theory that says increasing overall well-being is a good thing.
Totally. So Parfit basically threw down the gauntlet, right? He was like, okay, philosophers, find me a way out of this mess. Find a theory X that can solve the non-identity problem, avoid the repugnant conclusion, and deal with the mere addition paradox without creating a whole bunch of other problems.
And he himself admitted that he hadn't quite found that theory X.
Yeah, and this isn't just a problem for, like, hardcore utilitarians.
Right.
Most of us, even if we don't subscribe to utilitarianism fully, probably believe that we should try to make the world better.
Especially if we can do it without, like, violating anyone's rights or causing a lot of harm.
Exactly. And so when we look at those populations, A and Z, If we just set aside those other moral concerns like rights or justice, the repugnant conclusion is a real problem for anyone who thinks that well-being matters morally.
Absolutely. It's a fundamental challenge to our understanding of value.
So, faced with this seemingly inescapable paradox, philosophers have come up with a ton of different ways to try and get around it.
Yeah, the literature on the repugnant conclusion is massive.
And we can kind of group these attempts into a few main categories, right?
Right. They reflect different approaches to thinking about value and population ethics.
Okay, so let's dive into some of these attempted escapes.
Okay.
The first category, I think, involves coming up with new ways to combine or add up the well-being of all the individuals in a population.
Right, to aggregate welfare in a way that doesn't lead to the repugnant conclusion.
Okay, so what are some of those alternative principles?
Well, one of the most straightforward responses to total utilitarianism is the average principle.
Oh, okay, so what's that?
It's basically saying, look, instead of focusing on the total amount of well-being, let's focus on the average level of well-being per person.
So a world where everyone's pretty happy on average is better than a world with a lot more people who are only slightly happy.
Exactly. The size of the population doesn't matter as much as the average well-being of the individuals in it.
And how does this help us with the repugnant conclusion?
Well, remember figure 1.
Yeah.
Population A, where everyone has a really high quality of life, would clearly be better than population Z, where everyone's just scraping by, even though there were way more people in Z.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
And it also avoids the mere addition paradox right from the start.
Oh, so?
Because if you add people to A who have a lower quality of life, like in A plus there, the average well-being goes down, making A preferable.
Oh, I see. Okay, so it sounds like a pretty good solution.
It seems like it, right?
But I think you said there were some problems with it.
Yeah, unfortunately, the average principle leads to some pretty weird conclusions of its own.
Like what?
Well, for example, it implies that a world with just one person living a super amazing life would be better than a world with millions of people living really good lives.
Just because that one person is slightly happier on average.
Yeah, that's right.
That does seem kind of strange.
And even worse, it says a world with one person suffering intensely is worse than a world with millions of people suffering slightly less.
So the total amount of suffering doesn't matter?
Not according to the average principle.
Okay, yeah, that's a problem.
It feels wrong to disregard those extra lives completely, especially when we're talking about lives that might not be worth living.
It's like trading one kind of weirdness for another.
It is.
Yeah.
And ironically, some philosophers have argued that in certain cases, the average principle can lead to conclusions that are just as repugnant as the repugnant conclusion itself.
So it's not a perfect solution.
Not at all.
What's another approach?
Another approach is what's called a variable value principle.
Okay.
And these try to find a middle ground between the total view and the average view.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
The idea here is that the value of adding another good life to the world isn't always the same.
It changes.
Yeah. It gets smaller as the population grows. So adding a happy person to a small group is a bigger deal than adding a happy person to a huge group.
That makes sense intuitively, especially if you think about, limited resources and stuff.
Exactly.
But how does this help us avoid the repugnant conclusion?
Well, it suggests that there might be a limit to how much total good there can be. Like, imagine a pie.
Okay, I like pie.
You keep adding slices, but eventually the pie is full. You can't add any more.
I guess not.
So even if population Z gets huge, if everyone's well-being is low enough, it might never reach that limit.
So it never surpasses population A, even though A is much smaller.
Exactly.
Interesting. Are there any problems with this idea?
Well, yeah, it depends on how you set things up, but these principles can lead to some pretty strange outcomes too.
Like what?
Like the sadistic conclusion.
Okay, that sounds bad.
It is. It basically suggests that it might be better to add people to the world who are suffering than to add happy people.
What? How does that even make sense?
Yeah, it's really counterintuitive.
Yeah.
And then there's the absurd conclusion.
Okay, 2 for 2.
It comes from the idea that while the good you get from adding happy lives might level off, the bad you get from adding miserable lives might not.
Okay.
So you could start with a good population, add equal numbers of happy and unhappy people, keep doing that, and eventually end up with a bad population overall.
Oh, that doesn't sound good at all.
Yeah, it kind of undermines the whole point.
Okay, so maybe capping the good isn't the best way to go about it.
Right.
What's another way to modify total utilitarianism?
Well, another approach is to use critical level principles.
Okay.
And this is where we say, look, a person's life only adds to the good of the world if their well-being is above a certain level.
Like a threshold.
Exactly.
Okay.
And if someone's life is below that level, it doesn't add to the good, even if it's still technically worth living.
Interesting.
Hmm.
So how does that work with the repugnant conclusion?
Well, if we set that critical level high enough, then population Z, with its barely worthwhile lives, might not actually be adding any value at all.
So population A would still be better?
Right.
Okay, that seems like a plausible way out.
Yeah, it does. But the problem is figuring out where to set that critical level.
Yeah, that seems tricky.
It has to be high enough to avoid the repugnant conclusion, but not so high that we start saying good lives are bad.
Yeah, you don't want to rule out too many lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And some people also find it weird that adding lives that most of us would consider good could actually make the world worse.
Yeah, I can see that.
And just like with variable value principles, some versions of the critical level view can also lead to that sadistic conclusion.
Okay, so messing around with how we calculate well-being can solve some problems, but it often creates new ones.
Right, it's a delicate balance.
Okay, let's move on to the next category, then. I think this one involves questioning the very way we compare and measure well-being.
Yeah, this gets into some pretty fundamental assumptions about value.
It sounds like it.
So the idea here is to challenge the idea that well-being is just this simple, quantifiable thing that you can add up, like money.
Like $2 is always better than $1.
Right. This approach says, no, maybe there are different kinds of good, and some are so much better than others that no amount of the lesser good can ever equal them.
Okay, so give me an example.
Well, Parfit himself talked about how, as we move from population A down to Z, we might be losing the best things in life.
What did he mean by that?
He suggested that maybe the move from A to a slightly larger population with lower average well-being involves the loss of, say, experiencing Mozart's music.
Okay.
Then maybe we lose access to great literature, then beautiful cities, and all we're left with in Z is, as he put it, Muzak and potatoes.
Muzak and potatoes.
Yeah, that was his example.
Not very inspiring.
Right. And the superiority view says that the value of experiencing Mozart is so much greater than the value of listening to Muzak, that it doesn't matter how many people are enjoying Muzak and potatoes in Z, they could never outweigh the smaller group in A who have access to those superior goods.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's like saying you can't just make up for the loss of a masterpiece by giving everyone 1 million cheap copies.
Exactly.
Okay, but is that a strong enough argument against the repugnant conclusion?
Well, it faces some challenges. Even if we agree that some goods are superior, it might still be possible to construct versions of the repugnant conclusion that work even with those superior goods.
How so?
Well, what if the whoever lives in Z, even though they're pretty basic, still contains some small amount of those superior goods?
Like maybe they have access to some simple music or art, even if it's not Mozart.
Exactly.
Okay, I see.
And then there's the marginal difference argument. Imagine a whole bunch of days that are all really, let's call them beta days.
Beta days.
They're filled with Muzak and potatoes, nothing else.
Sounds rough.
Right. Now imagine a bunch of slightly better days. Just a tiny bit better, let's call them alpha days.
Okay.
The superiority view says that a finite number of alpha days is better than an infinite number of beta days, no matter how many.
Okay, that's the basic idea, right? Some things are just better.
But the problem is, if the difference between an alpha day and a beta day is really small, then it seems weird that that tiny difference in quality could create such a huge difference in value.
Yeah, like if the difference is just a few extra minutes of sunshine or something.
Right. It's hard to see how that tiny difference could justify saying a small number of slightly better days is better than an unlimited number of slightly worse days.
Okay, so the superiority view has its problems too.
He does.
What's the next category of responses? I think it has something to do with how we count well-being differently depending on time or possibility.
Right. This is where we get into person-affecting morality.
Okay, that sounds complicated.
It is a bit abstract. The basic idea is that something can only be better or worse if it's better or worse for someone.
Okay, so it's about the impact on individual.
Exactly. We're not just looking at the total amount of good or bad. We're looking at how it affects specific people.
And how does that relate to the repugnant conclusion?
Well, one way to interpret this is through something called comparativism.
Comparativism, okay.
And comparativism says, look, when we're comparing different possible futures, we should ignore the well-being of people who would only exist in one of those futures.
So if someone would only exist in population A, but not in population Z, we don't consider their well-being when comparing the two.
Right.
Okay, that's interesting.
So if there are people who exist in both A and Z, but are better off in A, then comparativism would say A is better.
Because those people are worse off in Z.
Exactly. But if A and Z are made up of completely different people, then comparativism might say they're equally good, or maybe even incomparable.
That doesn't really solve the problem of the repugnant conclusion.
It doesn't, does it?
No.
And it also leads to this weird implication that a tiny benefit for one person who exists in both scenarios could outweigh a huge loss for a whole group of people who only exist in one scenario.
Okay, yeah, that seems unfair.
It does. So focusing only on people who exist in both scenarios doesn't quite work either.
Okay, so what are some other person-affecting views?
Well, there's presentism,
Presentism.
which says we should only care about people who exist now.
So the well-being of future generations doesn't matter.
Not according to presentism.
Okay, that seems kind of short-sighted.
Yeah, most people think so.
Yeah.
Then there's necessitarianism,
Necessitarianism, okay.
which says there's a difference between people whose existence is guaranteed no matter what we do and people whose existence depends on our choices.
Like if we choose to have children.
Exactly. And then there's actualism,
Actualism.
which says there's a difference between people who exist in the real world and people who only exist in possible worlds.
Okay, so these views are all about when or how people exist.
Right.
And do they help us with the repugnant conclusion?
Well, they try to, but they often run into similar problems as comparativism. For instance, a strict presentist might say that it's okay to cause a lot of suffering for future generations if it benefits people living now.
That doesn't sound very ethical.
It doesn't, does it? And surprisingly, some philosophers have argued that in some cases, even the person-affecting view might not help us avoid the repugnant conclusion.
So it's back to square one.
Pretty much. It seems like focusing too narrowly on specific individuals can create just as many problems as it solves.
Okay, so we've tried tweaking utilitarianism, we've tried changing how we measure well-being, we've tried focusing on individuals.
Right.
What else is there?
Well, some philosophers have gone even further and suggested that we need to revise our very understanding of what it means for a life to be worth living.
Okay, that's a big one.
It is.
Like changing our whole view of human existence?
Yeah, pretty much. There are philosophers like Christoph Fahij and David Benatar who have put forward what are sometimes called Schopenhauerian theories of welfare,
Schopenhauerian, okay.
named after Arthur Schopenhauer, a pretty pessimistic philosopher.
Okay, that makes sense.
So Benatar, for instance, is a strong advocate for antinatalism.
Antinatalism.
Yeah, the view that it's always wrong to bring new people into the world
Because
because he thinks it's always worse to exist than to not exist.
wow, it's a bleak outlook.
It is. Fahij has a slightly different view. He says that only unfulfilled desires are bad, while fulfilled desires aren't actually good.
So the best life is just a neutral life.
Yeah, kind of like a 0 on a scale of good and bad.
Okay.
So if no life is truly good, then the whole premise of the repugnant conclusion that we're comparing a population with a very high quality of life to a population with barely worth living lives kind of falls apart.
Because there are no truly high-quality lives to begin with.
Exactly.
Okay, I see the logic.
It's a radical solution.
Yeah, it is. But do people actually believe this?
Well, these views are definitely controversial. Most people feel pretty strongly that their lives are worth living and that there's real value in existence.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that.
And Benatar's arguments have been challenged quite a bit.
Okay.
And Fahij's view leads to some strange implications, like it would mean a year of complete satisfaction is no better than 100 years of the same.
That doesn't seem right.
It doesn't, does it? And both of those would be better than 100 years. That includes even a tiny bit of dissatisfaction.
Okay, so those views, while maybe logically consistent, seem to go against our basic experience of life.
They do. They challenge a very deep-seated intuition that existence can be good.
What's next on our list of attempts to escape the repugnant conclusion?
Well, some philosophers have proposed that we might need to reject something called transitivity.
Transitivity, what's that?
It's the idea that if A is better than B and B is better than C, then A must also be better than C.
Okay. Yeah, that seems pretty basic.
It does, right?
Yeah.
But the repugnant conclusion kind of relies on that principle.
How so?
Well, it gets there through a bunch of small steps,
Yeah.
where each population is just slightly better than the one before it.
Okay.
So if we reject transitivity, we could maybe break that chain of reasoning.
Okay, so we could say A plus is not worse than A and B is better than A plus A, but not conclude that B is better than A.
Exactly.
Okay, I can see how that might work.
Right.
Yeah, I can see that.
Some philosophers, like Larry Temkin, have argued that the better than relation might not always be transitive, especially when we're comparing things that are very different in important ways.
Like populations with vastly different qualities of life.
Right.
Okay.
He even suggested that there might be two different kinds of better than.
Okay.
One that applies to, like, the inherent goodness of something, and one that applies to our overall preference or what we should choose.
And maybe the second one isn't always transitive?
Right.
Okay.
But rejecting transitivity is a pretty radical move.
Yeah, it seems like it could cause a lot of problems.
It could. Because if your preferences aren't transitive, it means someone could theoretically exploit you.
How so?
They could offer you a series of trays where you always prefer the new thing, but you end up back where you started, having lost something in the process.
Like a philosophical shell game?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay, that doesn't sound good.
No, it doesn't. And in ethics, it could mean there's no clear right answer in some situations.
So even if it helps us avoid the repugnant conclusion, it creates other problems.
It does. It challenges some very fundamental assumptions about how we make decisions.
Okay, so maybe not the best solution.
Probably not.
What else have philosophers tried?
Well, some have suggested that maybe we need to consider more than just well-being when we're thinking about ethics.
Okay, so bringing in other moral values.
Exactly. They argue that the repugnant conclusion arises because it focuses too much on just adding up happiness or well-being and ignores other things that matter morally.
Like what?
Well, one example is Fred Feldman's theory of justicism,
Justicism, okay.
which is basically a kind of utilitarianism that takes into account whether people deserve the happiness they have.
So it's not just about how much happiness there is,